Thanks, everyone. While we're waiting for our last handful of panelists to join us and for some more folks to roll on in as attendees, I'll start sharing our event. Welcome to the Mobility on the Frontline panel. This is an event for Boulder Startup Week's Energy Track. I'd like to take this time to thank our sponsors, Techstars, University of Colorado Boulder, Downtown Boulder Partnership, Name.com, and Honey. Thank you all so much for making this event possible today. I'd also like to thank VIA Mobility Services. VIA coordinated this panel today. We're a local 501c3 nonprofit organization. We primarily help older adults and people with disabilities get where they need to go in and around Boulder County. Looks like we're still waiting on a couple more panelists, but we'll jump into it soon. Welcome attendees, welcome Colleen, Rachel, Sarah, great to have you today.
Zoe, do you have a kitten? I can hear it.
Our co-facilitator.
No, I have one too. He's put away though because he's always meowing. So all of our staff members can tell you that, I'm certain.
You know, that was like clockwork. My husband, who's tuning in, just went to go pacify our kitty. If not, she'll be our co-host today. Hi, Heidi. Hi, Alexandra. Hi, Sarah and Sarah. Oh, Kevin, thank you. Hello, welcome, Kevin. I'll move on to introduce our panelists today. Please welcome Clark Ryder, our own University of Colorado Boulder's Sustainable Transportation Specialist. Hi, Joan with BTC. She's the Planner and TDM Outreach Specialist. Soon joining us will be Josh Sperling, Ph.D. He is NREL's Urban Futures Engineer. Welcome, Kathleen. Kathleen is the Deputy Director of Boulder County Transportation Planning. Kevin, hi. Kevin Crouse is the Executive Director of Boulder B-Cycle. And Natalie Stiffler from VIA Mobility Services is the Director of Operations. This panel is being facilitated by yours truly, Zoe. I am the Grants and Contracts Coordinator with VIA. Welcome, Angel. Welcome, Sarah. Our panel today is all about the new mobility challenges that we're facing resulting from the pandemic, especially on the front line. We'll review today how the pandemic is affecting Boulder's essential and frontline workers. We'll learn a little bit more about how energy, mobility, and sustainability relate during the pandemic. And we'll also think about what this might mean for the future. Thank you, every attendee, for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself in the chat. Share your name, share what you do, and where you're tuning in from. Remember that there are 3 features in your Zoom box that you can interact with during this panel. You're welcome to chat, you may raise your hand, or you may submit a question in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer everyone's questions today. If we don't get to them, we'll answer them later and send them on over to you. Hi, Jenny. Thank you, Ellen. Thanks, Sarah. It's great to see so much Colorado representation here today. Angel is tuning in from my neighborhood, Westminster. Hi. Welcome, Colleen. Is Tiny Town a tiny house area?
No, it's a little museum. I used to go there all the time when I was little. It makes all the houses and spaces that they have on the property look like you're a giant when you're so little. It's awesome.
That sounds very cute. Welcome, Heidi. Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. Yes, Lisa Curtis is VIA's own Director of Development and Community Outreach at VIA. She left her email address in the chat box there. Feel free to contact her about collaboration opportunities. Wonderful. It's wonderful to see so many folks joining in today. We're going to break our panel into 4 different sections. We'll try to keep it to about 15 minutes per panel topic. We're going to start with frontline workers. Then we'll move on to a couple other sections and we'll open it up to open Q&A. Don't forget to submit your questions either in chat or in the Q&A box. I'm going to kick us off with this first question here. What strategies and tactics are in place to help keep frontline workers as safe as possible during these pandemic days? Natalie, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, once I hit unmute. Hi everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, I'll kind of talk about what VIA is doing, what we've been doing over the last couple months. So a lot of it I think will sound pretty familiar to you. We've been working with our partners at the City of Boulder and RTD as well on a lot of these efforts. So a couple things. So we immediately we're lucky in that we got ahead on PPE to get everything ordered. So we have masks that we provide for all of our employees, all of our drivers, and we're requiring that they wear those when they're out in public and within our facilities. We also really started right away disinfecting our buses just more thoroughly and with an approved chemicals list that is known to kill the virus. So we have our drivers, they are cleaning the buses when they're out on their shift. So you might see them if you're still riding transit at all, wiping down high touch areas. And then we also have our buses disinfected. We instituted a strategy with our maintenance and cleaning staff to disinfect all of the buses daily. And so we've been doing that over the last couple months and we'll continue to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also are doing wellness checks for all of our employees coming in to our facilities before they start their shifts. So that includes a temperature reading and answering some questions. And they do that at the beginning and end of all their shifts. Anyone with any symptoms, is obviously required to go home right away. We're also doing physical distancing. So we're doing physical distancing within our facilities. We've designated where people can interact in shared spaces, and then as well as on our vehicles. So we've instituted physical distancing on all of our services that VIA provides, and that's different depending on the size of the vehicle. We've discontinued fare collection on all of our services, and for the HOP, we worked with the city and RTD on backdoor boarding. We were able to get that instituted a few weeks after all of this kind of started. So Lastly, kind of interesting thing that we're doing is we're installing sneeze guards on all of our buses, all of our vehicles. We've started with the hot buses, and hopefully you'll start to see those being rolled out over the next couple months. And it basically is just to give some extra protection for our drivers, especially as we go back to front door boarding and fare collection. We want our drivers to be as protected as possible. So those are some of the things we're doing. I'm sure I missed something, but yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalie. I'm wondering too, if Kevin, do you have any words to share on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. So I'm Kevin Crouse, Executive Director of Boulder Bike Sharing, and we're the nonprofit that owns and runs the Boulder B-Cycle system, those red bikes that have been on the street for, as of next Wednesday, 9 years in Boulder. We moved pretty quickly the middle week of March. We basically were all inspired. We're a small staff, 7, 3 full-time, 4 part-time. We all wanted to take action as quickly as possible to make sure our system, which has 300 bikes, to make sure that we weren't part of spreading coronavirus. And so we stocked up on our first 5 gallons of isopropyl alcohol from McGuckin. Also use a diluted bleach mixture for different areas of the bikes and stations. And basically began those cleaning protocols right away. Then we actually had we have an interesting situation where our version of no touch has been to advocate that people use the B-Cycle mobile app to check out bikes. So it really is possible to go about using the system only having checked out a bike using using the app, and then you're touching the handlebars, of course, the shifter and the brakes. And those are the high touch points that we're disinfecting out and about every day. And then what we were able to do in our workspace, in part because we're so small, is actually just stagger shifts so that we actually never have more than one person in our shop or office at a time. A very small space that has a door between an office and shop area, and so there's no more than one person in those places at any time, cleaning on their way out. And so it felt good that we were able to go forward in confidence, knowing that our bikes were out and able for people to use. What's interesting is that it's unlike any buses operated by VIA, all of our vehicles are unmanned by us at the time that people use them, and we have 300 of them. So we don't have any way of knowing for sure if a bike was disinfected between the last time someone rode it or someone who walked by, touched it, but didn't ride it. But what we are doing is trying to do everything that we realistically can with all those vehicles in service, and then also asking our riders to, of course, wear masks. Even before that was a requirement everywhere, and wear gloves, wash and sanitize hands, all that sort of good stuff. And then because most of our staff is not out in the field at any given time, any staff in the field are wearing masks. And then for office staff who are working at home, we haven't had any issues with personal protective equipment because we haven't had to actually stock up on all that much for our staff.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. There's a follow-up question from an attendee for Natalie. Are those who are doing deep cleaning receiving higher pay?
No, they aren't. It was definitely something we talked about. I think we would like to be able to do that. I won't get into it right now, but I know Lisa is probably thinking where I'm going to go with this. But we are definitely, from a funding perspective, in a challenging place right now. And so we just had to kind of make a budget choice about giving any hazard pay for now. Maybe that would be something that could change in the future if we can sort out funding for that. But it is definitely something that we would like to be able to do. It's just a matter of funding.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Would anyone else like to share about strategies and tactics keeping our frontline workers safe? Great, then we're going to dive on into that next question. How have the priorities of frontline workers changed or stayed the same since the beginning of this year? Would love to hear from you, Josh, on this one. Welcome. Josh, I'm going to unmute you here. And we're set.
Great. Well, can you repeat the question?
Certainly. Josh, how do you think the priorities of frontline workers have changed since the beginning of the year?
I'll say from a perspective at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we've been engaging with the city teams across the country, and in the context of our healthcare workers, our public transit workers, our folks who need to just provide a living for their families and are making choices that are putting food on the table. I think there's a trade-off space of concern for family members. So a personal example is my wife's colleagues in New York. Her college roommate, the husband, is working at the Cornell Medical Center in New York City and hasn't seen his 2 kids and his wife in almost 7 weeks now. They moved to the outskirts, and it's to protect his family members. Others have chosen to be near the hospital or volunteer in New York City, and I think that's an example of new forms of housing accommodation. But I think overall, in a city like New York, it's probably different from Boulder, but certainly a lot of people using public transit previously. And so what are the ways and people can get around without needing an automobile? I think there's some examples of access to micromobility, access to bicycles or bike sharing systems that are clean before and after each use. And then here locally, I sense that we have a community that's interested in protecting our frontline workers in a sense of adequate space and distance, wearing masks. But I think there's also a desire towards maybe more private vehicle trips than other modes of travel. And I think a big question for after this period is, do we see a significant surge in that type of travel, or do we continue to move in directions that the city and county is interested in of shared public and active mobility that's higher occupancy, which we know helps to create a sustainable mobility system from economic, environmental, equity perspectives. But I think there's an important trade-off space right now of individuals feeling safe and comfortable and perceived risk of transmission to being able to continue doing their jobs as best they can. So I'll just say a thank you to anyone who is a frontline worker or has family or friends that are. And that includes grocery store clerks and others as well who are just getting out volunteering to help older populations with grocery errands and so on.
Zoe, you're muted. Did you want me to add to that?
Yes, please, Natalie.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I think to what Josh was saying around just how people are prioritizing the balance between being able to work and earn an income and at the same time staying healthy and thinking about their family members. We've really seen that with our frontline and our drivers. You know, early on, it was, I would say, very challenging because we were balancing, you know, losing service because, as many know, VIA's most of our service is demand response, and so when the demand went away because of the stay-at-home order, we immediately didn't have service to provide. And so we had a lot of folks, we had to make some difficult decisions early on to figure out what we would do with our employees on the front line that no longer had work, and how would we help them continue to receive some type of income and benefits. And then for the folks that needed to keep working, because we still had some limited service. And over the last month, really, as the stay-at-home order has started to lift, and some people are getting more comfortable with returning to some demand response trips, we've had to figure out how do we balance, you know, bringing people back to work or keeping them working and also keeping them safe and healthy. And a lot of our drivers are, as you probably know, are older adults or have underlying conditions. And so, you know, they're at a greater risk. And so we need to, it's been super important for us as an organization to keep them healthy. And even if they don't, it's potentially a family member who that they care for, that they're worried about. So it's definitely, I'd say people's number one priority now is their health and safety. And it may have been before, but I think now it's competing even with income, because I think even as we're looking to bring people back to work, they're saying, well, you know, I think I'd rather just be home and stay safe, even despite the income that I might receive in returning to work. So I think that's been interesting to see, a little bit of a switch where before I think, you know, people's pay was probably a higher priority. So.
I see, thank you. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts to follow up with from the Boulder County perspective?
No, I think those are all really good points. Again, hello to everybody. It's great to be on the panel today. And I think there's just so much, so many great and interconnected topics that we're talking today about, because really it comes down, transportation is really about people and how are we moving people? How are we moving them from a workforce standpoint, for all the different services that people are seeking, and the frontline workers are so critical to everything. So I really appreciate everything that BIA is doing and all of the Boulder B-Cycle, everything that's out there that's happening. I would just make a suggestion that there's a lot of great resources on the Boulder County Public Health webpage. So if people are interested in how to ride transit or how to access services, different tips on how to go back to work and how to be safe, I would really recommend that people check out the Boulder County Public Health resources, and anything we can do to help, we would be glad to.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. It sounds like we're rolling into our next section on mobility. And I'd like to kick this off with a question directed at Joan. What were your priorities for mobility in Boulder County at the beginning of the year, and how have they changed or stayed the same?
Well, thanks, Zoe, for the question. And again, hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be a part of this panel and discussion. And I think that as one of the 2 transportation management associations throughout the Boulder County region, one of the biggest shifts that we've made in regards to mobility in Boulder County from the beginning of 2020 to the state that we're really in right now is we've been transitioning a lot of our programming efforts from really promoting multimodal transportation, but providing immediate teleworking assistance actually to businesses. We help people that also don't commute, which I think is an interesting perspective. But while we still promote green and clean, that is very hard to say, commute methods and modes like biking, taking transit, we've been postponing some of our celebrations of individuals that walk and bike or take transit to work during Boulder's Walk and Bike to Work month. And that normally takes place during June, and we've started to move that to a different time of year in September for the safety of others. But I think that our messaging at BTC has really stayed the same. We really want to help people with their commute options and ultimately get people out of their cars or single occupancy vehicles. So.
Wonderful, thank you, Joan. I'm thinking that, Clark, would you like to jump in on this as well? How has mobility changed?
Sure, yeah, so I'm Clark Ryder, Sustainability Specialist at CU. We've seen a real shift. You know, we've got about 9,700 employees and more than 20% ride the bus. And when you look at our essential employees or frontline staff, an even greater percentage is riding the bus or carpooling or vanpooling. And so being that that's not really an option, we've had to pivot. You know, the nice thing right now is we don't have people coming to campus, so we do have space for parking. So we've implemented some temporary parking for those folks and been working with the different departments to identify who's essential services and critical staff, and making sure that they have access to the buildings they need. It's going to be really interesting going forward if and when campus reopens and people start returning. How are we going to support those people if bus routes and bus schedules and van pooling is not available at that time? So that's something we're spending a lot of time looking at right now, because those are the folks that need to be able to get to campus, and a lot of those people can't really afford to live in Boulder, and so if their only option is to drive, or take the bus, how are we going to kind of support them without seeing a massive increase in the number of single occupancy vehicles?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other panelists feel strongly to jump in on this?
Yeah, actually, it's okay, Zoe, I'd like to jump in on this too. I think your question was interesting around, what were we thinking at the beginning of the year, and then where are we today? What's interesting for us at Boulder County, in February, the county adopted a new transportation master plan. So, mid-February, we're like, yay, everything's happening. Oops, sorry, I have a very large puppy, so you'll probably hear her bark. But so how we were ready to go and start moving into implementation of that new transportation master plan. And really what we've learned through this process is that we're still very much focused on that mission. So our goals, our policies, our action items are all very much the same. As many of the other speakers have said, we want to continue to focus on providing mobility options and choice for people. But what we've had to do is realize there's other types of options, or perhaps we have the pace that we roll out these different things may need to change. So for example, several of the shuttle services that we were getting ready to launch this spring for the Hesse shuttle, the El Dorado Canyon shuttle, we've had to delay those. And so we're looking to start those hopefully the 4th of July weekend. Instead, the climb, it's something that we work on with VIA. The climb service was suspended for a bit, but we're looking forward to getting that started again in June. So I would say our mission has stayed the same and our focus is the same. It's just how do we get there, and how do we take perhaps different tacks to get there in a way that's more adapting to the times that we're in. I think it's been really great to see the impact that teleworking has had, or teleservices, telemedicine, all of the things that people have been able to access without having to make a physical trip in their car. Sorry. So anyway, I feel like we're seeing a lot of potentially good things come, sort of a silver lining come out of this very tragic crisis. And so how do we leverage the progress that we've made and figure out how do we use the lessons that we're learning now to leverage our work going forward. So anyway, I'll turn this off so you don't have to hear her barking anymore at the neighbor.
That was excellent. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to momentarily direct us to a question from Colleen in the chat box. She asks, would bike shares be able to pivot to a weekly, monthly rental so that when it's turned in, it can go through a deep scrub? Joan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so I think this also ties into the frontline workers discussion that we were having previously, but we have a very small fleet of pool bikes at our organization. There's about 20 of them. And one thing that we immediately did when all this started to happen was we contacted some of those frontline worker organizations that we have those pool bikes at already, to make sure that if people are actually using our pool bikes that we have, how can we better clean them, disinfect them? Maybe it makes sense for one particular person to just check that bike out for the entire prolonged period of COVID. And we reached out to BCH, which is a community hospital in our area. I don't know if everyone is from Boulder, so we wanted to make sure that it made sense for those individuals to get services and try and commute in a clean fashion and a sustainable fashion. And so we had been thinking about those kinds of things, and I don't know if we will ever move forward in this way, but they decided that they did not want to move forward in that direction and just have the bikes on site as they are right now. But in the future, I think there maybe could be that opportunity. And I think that Kevin certainly probably would love to talk about this. And I'm sure Boulder B-Cycle has been thinking about this stuff too, so.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. I can jump in on that one. I think the short answer to like, have we thought about it or looked at it? Yes. We certainly could change around our pass offerings or the parameters of the existing passes we have to let people check out bikes for longer periods of time. And one thing we actually did was start up it's not a week or month-long program. We started up a delivery program offering bikes for free for use for 8 hours or even more at a time for any businesses who are just getting started and want to experiment with bike-based delivery. And so far, our use of that has been really small, but I mean, if you are connected with any businesses who might want to try delivering something by bike and have a shared bike to use for that whole period of time, if there's a shift, yeah, let us know. The reason we've opted not to go that direction at this point is that while our trips are down and lower than they would normally be this time of year, it's still not unusual for us to have north of 100 people a day using the system at large, which over the span of a couple days means that if we're giving those people bikes for 3 days or even a week at a time, we'd serve a lot fewer people. And one thing we really want the bike share system to be is always available, so that on demand there's a bike to get where you need to go, as opposed to more of a rental and reservation system. So I think for the moment we've opted to keep it as it has been, believing that we can keep it safe for people. If for some reason new information came out about the virus and we determined that truly the only safe way we could do this is to do extended rentals with deep cleanings in between every individual, we'd absolutely look to shift in that direction, just because the safety has to be the first element. And then, as long as we can meet that goal, continue meeting our nonprofit's objectives of getting people on bikes for short trips, positive environmental impact, health, and all of that.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
Zoe, I would chime in real quick. Our local nonprofit Ego Car Share is doing a similar long-term rental program where you can basically rent the car, I think for a week at a time at least, for a set fee where other people can't check the car out. So for folks that need that kind of access for those periods of time, that's available as well.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Clark. All right, big question for mobility. With shelter-in-place orders drastically reducing the number of cars on the streets, we're seeing more environmental benefits like dissipating smog resulting from fewer commuter cars in and out of Boulder. Considering that Americans are especially car-centric, do you think that there's an opportunity here to rethink cityscapes and mobility? And if so, what would you do with that opportunity? I'd like to start with you, Clark.
Yeah, I would say, more than an opportunity, there's an obligation. Like, we're in an inflection point here where we can, take what Kathleen was talking about, the silver linings, and really go after them, or we could let the cars slot back in and kind of leave us worse off than we were before. I think the positive thing is we're seeing it happen already. There's a lot of cities like Denver who are, cutting back on access for vehicles to certain streets to allow the pedestrians and cyclists and people moving about more space and social distancing. And I think we have a real opportunity here, while everybody's being affected in the same way, to shift the thinking about how we manage our spaces. And I saw an op-ed this week from Ben Holland at RMI and Kimball Musk about how we might rethink downtown Boulder during the summer and upcoming year to basically close the streets down. And I thought it was interesting. One of the lines said, doing so will produce benefits that exceed the benefits of curbside parking and traffic. So, we're starting to see it already, and I think we need to grab it and run with it. We need to really focus on how do we support more people on bikes? How do we push e-bikes more? That's now an option, a real commuting option. You know, I know at CU, we've about, of our permit holders, staff, there's about 3,000, and 33% of those live in Boulder. So those folks are driving majority of the time. How do we get them out of their cars? You know, how do we really grab onto this remote work, telework thing, and provide guidance and policies that will help organizations implement that at a broad scale? So I could go on and on, but I think, you know, there's a lot of opportunity. We really need to act and in unity to really push this.
Thank you. I'd like to bounce that over to Kathleen, please.
Sure. And again, I want to echo what Clark was saying. It is not just an opportunity, it's an obligation, and it's something that we really need to be focused on. We can't, it would be tragic to lose the ground that we've made. And so I think we need to figure out how, I keep using the phrase, how do we bounce forward? We're not bouncing back. We're not going back to normal. We need to be going to the next normal and the new normal, and figuring out how do we live into these new routines that we've now been, you know, all of us on all different ways have been working and getting goods and services in a long enough period of time now to create new habits. So it's not just like we had to do something for a week and quote survived it, but we've actually been able to form, I think, new healthier habits and be connected in different ways. And so I think we need to continue to focus on this, the air quality benefits. I mean, these are the types of strategies that we need to be doing anyway. Again, going back to Boulder County's Transportation Master Plan, we're basically now seeing what it would look like to have achieved that 20 years from now, right? So we're getting to experience that benefit at the front end of time. So how do we hang on to that, and how do we keep advancing the work? So I'll give some specific examples. I mean, certainly all the work around teleworking is huge, and we need to continue that. But I also think a lot of the corridor planning that we're doing over the years has really been centered around bus rapid transit, the highway improvements, and the commuter bikeways. So I'm speaking to corridors like 119 between Boulder and Longmont, and State Highway 7, and now the county's embarking on the US 287 corridor. So how are we integrating commuter bikeways into those facilities so that in addition to transit, there will also be opportunities for regional bicycle travel? So again, it gives us a chance to sort of reframe what we're doing, and most importantly, why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm really excited about it. I think that not only the quote infrastructure components and the programmatic side, I think that by being able to offer more online opportunities for people, it increases engagement. And I know it decreases the personal engagement, but it increases how many people can get involved and participate in a conversation. So it actually helps from a governance standpoint and a public participation standpoint, as well as a mobility standpoint. So I'm super excited about the future. I know it's horrible to be excited in the midst of a crisis and a pandemic. And so I don't mean it in that way. I just mean the lessons we're learning. I'm committed to figuring out how do we keep going with that momentum and not slide back to the past. So thanks for the chance to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and I'd love to kind of echo Kathleen's sentiments and do a little exercise. I have done this before in another webinar that I produced, but I think we have the biggest opportunity to spend time thinking thoughtfully about behavior change, and every single person in this session has the opportunity to think about the way they change their commute behaviors. And behavior scientists tell us that one of the best times to actually start thinking about how we change our behaviors is during a fresh start or a disruption or a change. And I think it's pretty much no question that we've been given a disruption in our life in the current state that we're in. And I think it also gives each person the opportunity to make that fresh start and try something new that they have not done before. So I'd encourage you all that are listening to me right now to just think thoughtfully more while you have this time about how you're commuting. And I'll put it out there that I'm happy to have conversations with you offline about this as well. And I think that if we have more time to talk about these things with individuals in our community that are thoughtful about these things already, and the things that we do every single day, how we can impact our lives from a holistic perspective, we'll gain a lot more clarity and insight into how we can make changes for the better. So, yeah.
If I may, I'd like to follow up on Joan's response there. I mean, this is it is a fascinating time and incredibly bittersweet that I'm in the midst of all the tragedy. Bikes are having this huge moment where a lot of them are sold out at bike shops and online retailers. Some larger and denser cities are seeing astronomical use of their bike sharing systems. Here in Boulder, I think what's kind of unique, I mean, among many things, is that our bike share system has actually seen pretty steadily increasing use over the last few years by people who we know are either commuting in for work or commuting in for school. And so we know that we're not their exclusive mode of transit. They're getting here, or transportation rather, they're getting here either by bus or driving or Uber or Lyft. And then they also have a bike as an option once they're here. And that's been fantastic. We're thrilled how multimodal our system has become. At the same time, we're assuming that moving forward, that people may be more hesitant to be on a bus coming into Boulder. And so we have a lot of room for growth among residents. And as Clark pointed out, those numbers of CU faculty and staff who even live within the city and work within the city. I think our organization feels that we've roughly hit the ceiling against how many locals are going to regularly take to their own bikes or our bike share system for all of their short trips around town. And so we're looking to see how we can add in e-bikes. Even if that means that a 2-mile commute that was certainly possible becomes something that someone would do more days a week because they have the assistance of an electric motor, or someone would do a slightly longer commute than they would have been willing to do before. So that's something our nonprofit is actively working on this quarter, is working on a strategic plan and really looking at how we can get e-bikes into our bike share system.
This is Josh. I'll see if I can build on this conversation. I want to go back to what Kathleen said of moving people. And I know for us, we're working on a project across the Department of Energy's Energy Efficient Mobility Systems program and the Department of Transportation. They have a national lab called VOLPI, where together we're trying to come up with new metrics for our mobility system. And I think where we've in the past had a focus on measuring vehicles, how do we do a better job measuring people and the movement of people in terms of enhancing mobility? And so maybe less emphasis in the future on vehicle miles traveled, maybe more emphasis on can we begin to gain observability into increasing, not decreasing. I think we're finding interest in a lot of positive language now. More person miles traveled, for perhaps less vehicle miles or more clean vehicle miles, that it helps to achieve less congestion, less pollution. And I think there still has to be this important, maybe before mobility and before energy. I think for us, we're realizing the primary goal right now is perhaps both health and economy. So saving lives, reducing transmission or cases, supporting vulnerable populations. And then I think we've learned that inequity does come out in these types of crises. And so focusing in on the 30 million people across the country or more who've lost their jobs, I think there's an important question now of how do we consider and help to address the lives of these people who have lost their jobs? How does mobility past problems, maybe it was spatial mismatches, jobs farther from housing, or people not able to afford housing anymore because they lost their job, they're now moving farther away from where the jobs are located. How do we have mobility work better for them? And maybe how do we find and create new jobs through thinking about mobility differently? I think this was in Los Angeles. They said every city, every state government now has to be in the jobs creation business and doing so in a way that still helps to achieve our goals as a community. And I think of one example here being public transit. I think that's a key area where we've really lost ridership, and VIA probably knows this better than anyone else, but looking forward, I think there's a way to reimagine or envision a brighter future, more attention to not only it being affordable and a reliable option, but maybe safer, healthier, connected with other types of choices like micromobility or active travel. But I think there's also a concern that we could head towards a worst of times where there's dried up funding, less service available, people move to private everything because it's more reliable. And so I think there's a lot of important choices and decisions moving forward. And if we're successful here, I think it may be through defining new metrics that we think are important to track in the context of bouncing forward. And then also have our systems a bit more tailored to different types of needs. So I think we had a system set up for maybe different baseline criteria before. Being able to understand the needs of our community, how are the services designed to meet those needs, I think will help us to succeed.
Wonderful, thank you very much. We do have a question from the attendees. Do the panelists think that the number of commuters will increase as people can no longer afford to maintain vehicles? Anyone feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in. This is certainly not from the same educated perspective that Josh brings to this, but I think that we're in Boulder bike sharing making the assumption that there will be potentially an increase in the length of some super commutes will become that much more super, especially in Boulder, where it's unlikely that even a situation like this will reduce housing costs. However, I think we're also assuming that there's going to be a number of people who don't go back to in-person work or simply aren't commuting into Boulder for their jobs as much as they were before. I'm assuming those jobs are still around. And so what we've kind of assumed is that one thing that will change is that people's commutes will become less of a same, if it's a Monday through Friday job, the same exact thing each day at the same time, and slightly more of an ad hoc situation, especially if it's either some days are work from home or there's an intentional staggering of start and end times in order to not to reduce peaks on public transit and congestion on roadways too. So we're basically assuming we'd like bike share, the role of bike share in that to be that it's as easy as possible to call upon at any time when you need it, and that being potentially different from someone who already had an existing pattern where they repeated the same steps each day.
Great insight, thank you so much. This is a great segue to our final, almost final section before the open Q&A, energy and sustainability. So Clark, I'd like to start this next question off with your response. Do you anticipate a surge in single occupancy vehicles post-pandemic? What actions might we take to keep single occupancy vehicles off the road in the future?
Yeah, my gut says yes, we'll definitely see a surge. I mean, it might take a little while as organizations are slow to ramp up, but being that the price of gas is going to be super duper cheap, I don't see a reason why people wouldn't be driving if they could. You know, they're not going to want to be in buses. They're generally not going to carpool. So, you know, eventually I think we'll definitely see an uptick. You know, on campus, we're in a bit of a unique scenario in that we only have so much parking, right? So how many people are forced to park elsewhere? That's another question we're going to be trying to answer, is like, how do we really empower them? But I mean, I think the answer for us is to really focus on the little things. So as we've talked about a lot, like the remote working, you know, at the university, you know, we've got some staff that are daily shift workers. Like a lot of them are going to have to come in. So especially with frontline employees, for us, you know, that a majority of them are, you know, housing and dining, custodial staff and folks like that. They're going to have to be coming in to support the students. But on the other side, with the faculty who are teaching, or researchers, or some of the folks like myself who could do a lot of my work remotely, like Kevin talked about, are there ways that we can do rotations of days that you're at work or not. So that's a huge opportunity. Like I said before, I think we'll do a lot of focus outreach on the people that live close enough to get here somehow other than car, be it bike, e-bike, walking, that kind of thing. And then, you know, one of the things we're going to kind of have to figure out is the Uber and Lyft scenario. You know, we've got a lot of students who are taking Ubers and Lyfts just to get to class. So we're going to have to think a lot about our curbside management and like access points. The one kind of big caveat to all this is we're going to be doing it all with smaller budgets and fewer people. You know, City of Boulder, Go Boulder staff is down to 4 people of many. So it's going to be super tricky. But so I think the answer is like, we're going to have to focus on a lot of the small things.
Thank you, Clark. Josh, do you have ideas on what we might do to keep SOVs off the road as we move forward?
Yeah, can I share one image? I'll share my screen. Oh, host disabled screen sharing. If it's possible,
I just disabled that. Go for it.
Okay, let me see if this works. So it's actually from the city of Bogota, and it's not going to be representative of Boulder, but I think it's an interesting image of a survey that was done, and we could consider doing something similar for Boulder, where it's before March 20th and then predicted of what could happen here as the new modal split. And so keep in mind here, it's a location where there's probably much less private vehicle ownership. So you have 41% in transit, 23% active travelers, walking, biking, 19% in motor vehicles, as both cars, private cars and motorbikes, 16% in TNCs or taxis, and 1% telework. And so they're projections here, and maybe they're off, and maybe we just see a big increase in private vehicle or individualized travel. Or we might see an uptick in telework over time. People become more comfortable with this as a social norm. Maybe it's not every day they miss being in the office, but they'll say, okay, I'll do 2-3 days a week from home, go into the office 1-2 days or 3 days. Maybe we see less on transit. They're predicting a 50% decrease, which is pretty significant. But they're also saying a large portion of those folks might become active travelers, and maybe that is consistent with the Boulder community, that we choose a pathway of more walking, biking, electric bikes, electric scooters. So I think it's TNCs, taxis. I think Clark brought that up. Both Uber and Lyft have canceled their pooling service, and if you think back to my colleague Alejandro's research, when we had the early forms of ride hailing before there was higher occupancy options, it was private, there's a large amount of deadheading. And so that could be a ongoing consideration of not really seeing large gains. And so what happens, or how do we get to an environment again where if we do see an increase in TNCs, what can that service look like, or what's the way in which we can operate it as an on-demand, and maybe via type vehicles are a better option for more spaced out. If we get 2-3 people in via vans, that could be a new form of on-demand mobility. So I'd love to see what this could look like for our Boulder community, maybe as a future month or two ahead, what that mode choice prediction and then what the actual might look like. But I've also seen a lot of not too much changes. As much as we think all these behaviors might become very different, there's a good article by Ram Pendiala. He's at Arizona State University, and he's got a good set of 2 blogs of studying human behavior over time and changes during different events and shocks. And just listened to a webinar yesterday on telework that we've had this technology and option for a long time, and there's a reason that it hasn't really substantially increased. And so I think there's important aspects to consider around travel behavior, of the options and the barriers and the reasons we travel the way that we do. I think it's a fascinating time. as well as a challenging time. And even with reopening our economy, I think there's going to be a gradual transition here of the new choices that people are making. Especially, I'm a new parent, 16-month-old, and so without daycare, without childcare, it changes willingness to go into the office, I think, until those services are available again. And I'll admit that having children in the household and the data we see of going from single to a family with 2 kids really changes travel behaviors in a substantial way. So I think being sensitive to these different user groups, understanding which ones, older populations, younger, with kids, without kids, lower to higher income, those sorts of dynamics in a survey might help us understand what happens in terms of the single occupancy vehicle or new mode choice dynamic.
And I do want to jump in, Josh, because I actually am working with the Association for Commuter Transportation at a national level on distributing and disseminating a survey very similar to this. And we should definitely talk more about that offline, because you definitely have a much broader research background than I do, certainly with a PhD. So I think that you probably offer up some really awesome discussions, and we want to hopefully administer that type of survey at a local level in Boulder and maybe get some data and facts on that. And I guess going back to Zoe's question about SOVs and the use of that post-pandemic, I think a lot of us anticipate in the transportation planning world that we're going to see a surge in SOVs. And I think that there are ways, as I mentioned previously, that we can change our behaviors for commuter habits. And one of the biggest things that I think we can take into consideration, because there's not a one size fits all perspective, as Bobby mentioned in the comments, there are people that, you know, are housekeepers or people that work in retail that don't have these opportunities. And for them, I think the biggest action that we can take to keep those SOVs off the road in the future is creating infrastructure to use micromobility if people are afraid of those shared spaces. Post-pandemic, cycling is certainly an extremely safe way to travel from point A to point B when you're not constrained in a physical space. But also, I do want to shout out to VIA and RTD that they have been truly trying their best to ensure that distancing is done, vehicles are clean, and that riders must wear masks, as Natalie mentioned before. And I think that that is, you know, for someone who cannot afford a vehicle or the vehicle maintenance, that is something to really keep into consideration. But for those of us individuals who are very privileged, some tips I will offer up from the perspective of BTC to employers that offer programs like parking cash out. So you can provide incentive-based programs so that people don't drive to work, or ensure your employees can work remotely by providing those telework programs and developing those. And we'd be happy to help you with developing those programs at any time.
Great. Could I jump in here too, Zoe? Yep. And I just want to build on this. And I think that I want to start by giving a shout out to Angel Bond, who's on the call as well from Boulder County. And again, the partnership work between the county and VIA and RTD and all the cities, I think really is a testament to how do we provide mobility options today and going forward. In particular, Angel's program for Mobility for All is a great place and a great resource to reach people who are at all ages and stages of life, who are most vulnerable populations, are growing numbers of older adults and people with disabilities. So I'd really encourage more outreach and more engagement with Angel and the Mobility for All program. And just piggybacking on that, I think as we go forward, that one of the other silver linings that we've experienced during this time has been fare-free transit. And that is something that provides, it truly removes a barrier for transit access for people, particularly the lowest income populations who may or may not be able or eligible to apply for some of the different programs that are out there. So are there ways that we, again, could sort of hang on to some of those barrier-free approaches so that we're making transportation options more sustainable and more affordable for people going forward. And again, there may be different models of service, and I like the point about, you know, how do we reimagine transit and what are the new types of transit and new types of partnerships. And again, I think VIA has been very effective and very nimble in that space to work with the county, work with local communities to find those solutions. So again, I think it's important to think about the breadth of our communities and everybody who we're trying to serve, and appreciate all the work that's going on.
I was just gonna add, and this will kind of get into, I think, a question that would be coming, and we can maybe address with this, because it's kind of been talked about, and it was the point about how people can travel, and I think for the, sorry, I got distracted. So for transit, I mean, there are a lot of folks that are riding because they have no other option, right? And so we'll have to continue to be able to provide service, and I say we as in like all transit agencies, right? And a big issue with that, to be able to provide service for our essential workers, is we need funding to do it, and all of our funding sources have dried up. So, you know, fare revenue is such a small portion of funding. Like, I don't feel like I could make an argument that we need fare revenue to return. Most systems don't survive off fare revenue across the country, in our country. So, but sales tax revenue is drying up. So to me, and I was going to make this point later, is that like we really need to be advocating at the federal level to provide public transportation funding in a way that they never have before. And this gets to the question of, for older adults and people with disabilities, in order for us to safely provide transportation for folks in a way where we're not putting 3 or 4 people on a 14-passenger vehicle, because at that point they're no longer physically distancing. It goes against our productivity goals, right? Like, we used to be saying, well, let's try to get 3 or 4 people on per trip. And for the next couple years, that may just not be something that we, you know, philosophically can do to keep our riders safe, which means we're going to need more funding. And funding was already hard to come by. So I think this, you know, it sets us up, and Josh made the point about micro-mobility and an opportunity for VIA to come into that space, because we do have larger vehicles and we can accommodate, you know, more than just one person in a vehicle, like Lyft and Uber can only do at this point. But that means, you know, how are we going to get creative about funding those options for people? And to me, that's, you know, one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to overcome in order to adapt to, you know, what's needed during a post-pandemic world.
Can I weigh in here on the funding piece? Because I think it's a really crucial component of this. And I think that, the crisis that we're in has illuminated a lot of things. And it's really, I guess, brought to light the cracks in the system, in the fact that we have structural problems with how we're funding transportation. And so, you know, for many years, I mean, for decades, we've been running after trying this or trying that, but foundationally our transportation system has been funded on the gas tax, and it's been funded on sales tax, and then, you know, little bits like Natalie said, through fare revenue or other types of things. So I think this opportunity we're in, and Joan, as you said, to thoughtfully think about where we are and how we come through. I think we need to think about how we fund transportation from a structural standpoint, and that's a big question, and it's hard to answer, but if we're going to have a different transportation or different mobility future, we need to be thinking about how do we fund it differently. And certainly that's at the federal level, it's at the state level, it's locally, it's through the county. But I think that's, again, what this crisis has presented us with, is an opportunity to have those hard conversations. I mean, we've seen firsthand the vulnerability of sales tax. We've seen the vulnerability of the gas tax, and the bottoms falling out of our transportation money. So we need to figure out, how do we reframe this, and then how do we invest that money And how do we invest those few precious dollars that we have in transportation, again, back to serving people? And so serving people through transit, new types of transit, allowing more flexibility in how we spend the money. We could have a whole webinar on funding, but you know, our federal system is so traditionally structured in that there's highway money, there's transit money, there's airport money, we need like mobility money, and we need to figure out how is there more flexibility across those pools of funds at all levels. And so I think that's a challenge that all of us need to step into the space and figure out what can work, and then how do we take each one of those dollars and leverage it as much as we can, and how are we maybe shifting how we've resourced transportation in the past and put more emphasis and more dollars into these more sustainable mobility options. And when I say sustainable, I truly mean socially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable, and financially. So anyway, so I appreciate you raising the financial piece, because it's crucial, and we're all facing it, and we're going to have to get through this crisis. So it's good to go to work on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I know that we have some outstanding questions in the chat, and also those that have been submitted prior. We are unfortunately running out of time, but we will follow up with you offline. After this webinar ends, you will be redirected to a page where you can get on an email list, very non-obtrusive email list monitored by VIA, and we can send out responses to those questions to you afterwards. At this time, I'd like to thank all the panelists again. This was a really great discussion. I really appreciate your insights. I'm sure we all do. And I'd like to welcome Lisa Curtis, VIA's own Director of Development and Community Outreach, to share a short message.
Thank you, Zoe. I really appreciate all your work putting this panel together and leading the discussion. It was a great job. I really enjoyed it. It's very interesting. And thank you to all the panelists. I just wanted to kind of, there's so many ideas that are really, I think, critical to just making our world more livable, our communities more livable, and transportation is such an essential part of that. And it's also an essential part of environmental sustainability going forward. So I would like to invite everybody to pay attention to VIA's first Thursdays, the first Thursday of the month. We're continuing conversations like this on Zoom. It's sort of a virtual happy hour, and it's a casual space to kind of continue talking about these ideas. So check our website to get more information about that. We've already had the first Thursday for May, but there's still June to come. So please keep track of that. I just wanted to say really quickly that, you know, VIA has been known for its caring, customer-focused transportation service for older adults and people with disabilities and others with mobility limitations. But I'd also like to remind people that VIA does provide public transit, and we are, under our current leadership, we're moving more in the direction of working closely with local governments to expand our role in public transit. And I think, and I really appreciate Kathleen's shout out to us in terms of our innovation and nimbleness and willingness really to work on new ideas in the transit realm. And I hope that, you know, we can continue conversations about that and let people know what we're doing in the public transit realm as well, because we're really, our goal is really equitable and accessible, affordable, and environmentally sustainable transit for everybody. There was so much that I enjoyed, so many phrases and stuff, the idea of bouncing forward. I love that. I'm going to steal it. So thanks everybody for joining us, and hope to talk to you soon in other venues. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to VIA for hosting.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.